Welcome to B&W Insights. I'm your host, Mark Seifert. In today's episode, myself and guest Coilin McConnell talk about ecology, construction, and stewardship in the world of natural resources. Ready? Let's go. Coilin, thanks for coming on the podcast. Great to have you here today.
Morning, Mark.
So, natural resources, we heard that term in grade school, but what in your background drew you to natural resources?
So, the love of national parks. When I was little and even going through college and stuff, I went to a lot of national parks. I actually worked out at Wind Cave National Park out in the Black Hills. Did a lot of work with the Conservation District during college and stuff. And my degree basically in soils and ecology led to this field.
So you talked about your love for the national parks, but now it's into this construction, ecology, stewardship triangle of natural resources. How did you take that from, the love of nature to actually applying it?
So my career has evolved over many different steps. When I first came out of school, I worked for a surveying and engineering company for about 10 years, designing detention basins, native detention basins, and site plans and engineering work. Worked for a surveying company that was kind of a combination. And then I created McConnell Environmental in '08, and then I started doing a lot of the work. I started with the delineation work, which it was the forefront of the development in most of the cases. And when then that involved into the clearing of the brush in the wintertime, because in natural resources, you have to have a job for every season, because wetland work is only in the summertime. So then I needed a brush season. So that was wintertime. Then I needed to evolve into burning season in the spring and the fall. And as that evolved with the restoration aspect, the stewardship more likely, I was starting to then get, as a DECI inspector, we rolled into the construction and doing the erosion control, the seeding, the blanketing, all that type of stuff. And that's just basically how the evolution came. And then when I came to work for Baxter and Woodman, I was hired as a wetland delineator. And basically, as part of that meeting, John and Lou were asking, what else could I add to Baxter? And that's when we just started discussing the stewardship, which at that time, a lot of clients were starting to do retrofitting of their basins into the stewardship mode. And then we rolled into the stewardship, and then basically within a month after that, we were starting to do our own design, build, and construction. And
So
it's
it
just
really
evolved.
grew. It has grown and evolved.
It has,
And
yes.
that's awesome to hear. So what is, we talk about this natural resources team that you have.
Mm-hmm.
You've mentioned the ecology, the construction, the stewardship. Can you give our listeners just an overview of the services that you provide? Just, you mentioned the 4 seasons.
Right.
Kind of go through some of those seasons and what are some of those services you provide?
So we kind of look at it as a big circle. So in a lot of cases, the ecology kind of comes in front, does the assessment, does the delineation work, tree survey work, that sort of thing. Then that evolves into what can we help the client do after the assessment is done. Sometimes it's going right into stewardship. Okay, a native area that needs to be maybe brush cleared, burned, reseeded, something like that. It may go into construction. Okay, a lot of creek work, detention basin retrofits where we have to come in, clean out the sediment, stabilize the creek work, and then the stewardship would follow the construction. And as you work through that circle, every year, then the stewardship has to be reassessed by our ecologists. And then after a 3-year cycle, depending on if we hit the standards that we needed to hit, then we can either move out or we can continue doing the stewardship. But it's one big circle. And I kind of use it as a 3-leg tripod. We can't do stewardship without construction. We can't do construction or stewardship without ecology and the assessment. And basically, ecology kind of brings it all back together or starts it. So I call it's a big circle.
Now, when you mention clients, is it just municipalities? Is it park districts? Who needs this work?
Everybody needs this work. We do work for municipalities. We do work for conservation areas, forest preserves, HOAs and subdivisions, They have detention just as much as everybody else. We even do a lot of work for homeowners that have 5 to 20 acre pieces of property that are looking to do restoration, brush clearing. We've actually helped some private homeowners get into easements, conservation easements with other programs type of things. So we help anybody that's willing or interested to improve their environment.
So for a municipality or a park district or a government agency, what triggers the need for this work to be done? How do they know, with a linear, like a water main or a sewer main, when it starts breaking, when you're working at a road, when there's potholes, when the road starts to break down. But natural resources is probably a little more fluid of when do they need to start working? When do they need to start planning? What is that, how do they get into your circle?
So a lot of the circle starts with maybe the watershed plan, which now we do in-house. So once the watershed plan gets created, and a lot of it's based off of stormwater. If the detention basins are full of sediment, why is there so much sediment in the detention basins? How come they're not draining properly? How come these particular properties are flooding? That kind of triggers the motion of what is going on. This is the problem. What is causing it? And then as they develop the watershed plan, they start investigating some of the creeks, some of the streams, some of these areas where have been eroded highly, or the detention basins are starting to not function the way they were supposed to function 20 years ago. That's when we kind of get involved and we kind of help out. We've had a couple examples where the municipality stated, well, we have a flooding issue here. It's not holding all the water back. And we were brought in not to just solve that problem, but we investigated all the way up the stream, and we realized the issue was actually 2 miles up the stream, and they had to solve those problems to fix the flooding issue downstream.
So you talked about one project, but I assume you have a Rolodex of amazing projects that have been involved in. But what's one that that really sticks with you, because whether it was tough or it made such a huge impact, or it was what was the one that if you could tell a story about one project, what is it?
I think it was we did a project for our village of Algonquin, and it was called the Randall Road Wetland Enhancement. We put in a 65-foot large span bridge.
Okay.
We built a area to hold back water. What the village was trying to do is they're trying to use an existing wetland area that was extremely degraded, and use it as stormwater storage for the municipality growth along Randall Road. So we actually built these 20-foot high berms, put in structures for low flow, had a large rock overflow weir. We built a bridge over the top of that weir, stabilized the creek downstream beyond that point, and we've been in the process. We're on year 3 of completely stabilizing the degraded wetland and turning it into a higher quality wetland right off Randall Road. The total acreage was about 40 acres. So between the bridge, the detention basin that the HOA owned right next to it, we converted that into a native basin. So it was a little bit of almost everything we do in one large project in an urban environment, which is difficult.
I'm sure.
The neighbors and people around these areas are like, these were beautiful areas and you just destroyed it and the wildlife will never come back. And as people are discussing this with us, and I say discuss, deer are walking behind us 20 feet, walking through the newly created corridor that now they can move around in.
Right.
And so that project basically kind of engulfs everything we kind of do all the way around.
So just to follow up is you can design.
Yes.
You can construct it.
Correct.
And then you do the maintenance of it.
Correct.
So it's a full service of, and you keep mentioning 3 years. Is that the typical lifespan or the typical time frame of how long it takes from once it's constructed to kind of establish a solid growth in there? Or what is that 3 year?
Basically. So in most cases, that's the performance standard timeline that we have to take what the designers envisioned and get it to as close to the product as possible. in a native environment, the first year has very minimal growth. Native plants take almost a year to year and a half to establish their root zones before they come up and start creating the flowers and the grasses that we need.
Right.
So basically by year 3, you have a 70 to 80% vision of what was entailed. The last 20% is just the stewardship. So if you take it to the 3 years, you have to maintain it. And I always have the phrase is if man creates, man must maintain. And in a lot of our urban environments, we've created them, but over the last 25 years, nobody's been maintaining them. Right. And that's what we're trying to do now is go back to where it was originally, fix it, maintain it, and then keep it up.
So, you mentioned this project, and and we look at how everything you're doing is helping the environment. And how did this, how does the construction, to the people who say, you mentioned the residents who the wildlife's never going to come back, it's never going to look great. What do you say to them that how does this actually improve the environment?
Basically, because of the growth. We do a lot of work in urban environments where these little creeks and streams, 30 to 40 years ago, we're not taking the amount of stormwater that we are now putting into them because of the development along the roads, the major roads, all these subdivisions, these HOAs that have been popping in and here and there. Because of that scenario and because of the amount of influx of water based on these rain events that we're having, these little streams can't take it. And we have to help them maintain that new water level that they were not used to getting before. And sometimes that means putting in rock armament. That means creating floodplain benches that were there 30, 40 years ago that have basically have disappeared because the creek has now incised so much because of the flush of the water that comes in these rain events.
So it's a combination of new technology but also taking it back to what it was 30 and 40 years ago.
Correct. Yes.
So how do you balance the needs between the natural resources, the stream, the environment, and those of development? Because I assume that our clients who are a municipality, they're looking at how can we keep this stream how it is, but also we know we need to develop this land right next to it. Is it a balance of how do we, is it a balance of making sure that the nature comes first, or is it a mesh of the two?
It's got to be a mesh of the two. I mean, we're very realistic in our designs, knowing that the HOA or the home or the water main of the street has to be within a certain area of our corridors, right? So the question is, how do we make that balance? How do we create the balance between urban sprawl and the environment that needs to stay there? And it's a tough challenge sometimes, but that's what we find interesting is trying to create that balance.
It's really creating the balance of man and nature.
Correct. Yes.
And we look at, technology is always happening. Things are always developing. But we're also trying to take a stream back to how it was 20, 30 years ago and put nature back in nature. Mm-hmm. So where do you see our natural resource department developing? It's ever evolving, I assume there's new technologies, but where do you see this growth and this work going?
So the creek corridors in all these urban environments is going to be ongoing. What we find as the new growth is a lot of these detention basins that are 25, 35 years old that have been completely grown in with cattails and willow and phragmites, and they're just not doing what they were supposed to do when they were firstly designed. So we are starting to see more and more municipalities and subdivision HOAs having to go back, clean out these basins, and instead of creating turf right down to the edge, which is what the concept was 30 years ago as a park, we are now converting them more to a native buffer because the native vegetation has 24 to 36-inch root zones, and they'll stabilize that slope from wave action and from water elevations of fluctuation. That seems to be where it's now evolving into.
And these don't have to be giant multi-million-dollar projects. You're talking about cleaning out a retention or a detention pond.
Correct.
So this could be a small area, little stream projects. These natural resource projects aren't over huge acreages of land, correct?
No, and in reality, I mean, we've had a couple projects that are over $1 million. but we're talking 60 to 80 acres of restoration. So if you kind of break that down, you're still talking 5,000 or 6,000 an acre.
Right.
And that includes creek work and largest amount of stabilization and restoration work to doing a native detention basin at a school district for $85,000.
Right.
It just depends on what is needed and what the budget is. But yeah, I mean, most of our stewardship budgets are for our homeowners is $5,000 to $6,000 a year. So it just is all over the place.
So two things I want to touch on that you brought up were turf grass should not go down to the water line, and that you see as you drive across the country, you see so much turf grass going down straight to the water line.
Correct.
And as you mentioned, the wave action, and especially when you get out in some of these neighborhoods where you don't have established trees, there's whitecaps on some of these lakes.
Correct.
And it really breaks down that shore.
Mm-hmm.
People, on the flip side, a lot of residents say, well, that native vegetation promotes wildlife and animals in my neighborhood. But what's that balance?
Well, the wildlife is there. It doesn't matter if we bring in native vegetation or not. I mean, I live in a small community in Wonder Lake, and we are all residential homes, and I have bunnies, I have everything all around our house. So when they say it's grass, what the grass is promoting is erosion and cutting of the bank. Geese love regular grass over native. So you put in a native strip of 30 to 40 feet, you're going to eliminate that goose population along your detention, which is going to eliminate the goose poop and all the other stuff that comes along with it. And what we've actually done on certain things, because people say, well, we want to get to the pond and we want to fish it and so forth, we've actually put in fishing outcropping stone every couple 100 feet around the pond so that people can still access the pond.
And use the pond.
But it's still natively, kept. Correct.
Nice.
Plus, the native vegetation strip on those ponds and detention basins actually filters out a lot of the fertilizers and things that people put on their grasses to keep the water clean. So it's more of a purifier as well.
So, you've mentioned work at a school district. Do communities or school districts ever use the work you're doing for public education?
So we do a lot of work for forest preserves. We do a lot of work for conservation districts. We do a lot of work in school districts. And we have installed a lot of signs, educational signs along the trails and along concrete outcroppings and adjacent to these basins. And yes, some of the grants that they are getting from the states and from other locations, they want the signs put in there for educational purposes.
So when you talk about, this advancement and moving in the future, is there any technology? We've talked to Andy Zlettel from our GIS department. We've talked about a lot about the drones that we have.
Yes.
Are we incorporating those other departments in the drone work and any other technological advancements to help natural resources?
So it's funny you brought this up. We most of the construction is hands work, shovels, excavators, backhoes. Some of the attachments change, but overall, the stabilization of the creeks seems to evolve. We are looking at a project that we are going to try to go after that has what they call filter bags. It's 3 tons of rock into a bag that you put on a hoop, and you set it down into the creek, and it amorphs and creates into a stabilization form. That's something new. You're talking gabion baskets are a little more new. We do a lot of creek work where we use natural rock boulders instead of riprap. It stabilizes it, but it gives it that natural feel.
Right.
We are doing some work for DuPage County Forest Preserve. They use drones to do herbiciding. So we are going to look into that as a scenario with our group of drone personnel in Baxter to see if that's something that we could give that as a service to forest preserves, because there's areas that we just can't get to depending on how far they're out in the middle of a wetland area where drones can apply herbicide.
That's awesome.
So these are things that are starting to come up that at Baxter we have the capabilities. It's just, okay, who do we need to talk to? How do we need to figure this out?
And let's do it.
And the Natural Resource Department works with basically every other department, either on working with seed specifications for certain projects or working with tree surveys on projects, delineation. So we know how to kind of work together as a group.
So if a community or a municipality or a park district is listening to this podcast and they know they have work to do, they know they have detention basins that, have turf grass, or they know they have an area that needs to be worked on. They don't know how to start. How do they start?
Biggest thing is to get us out there and do an assessment. Figure out what we can help them with. We can usually create a very rough budget to kind of help them figure out where the finances can come from, how much it's going to be. That's basically the starting point.
Is come up
Take
with
a
a plan.
look at it.
Take a
Yes.
look at it and come up with a plan.
Yep.
If to wrap up, if there's one thing you want our listeners to know about natural resources, is what is it? Give me your elevator pitch. Give me your what is so important, and why is it important that we are working on our natural resources and bringing nature back to where it was?
I want to emphasize this. We are leaving these natural areas for the next generation. So what I'd like to say is we always want to leave these environments healthier than when we got them. And that's what I'd like to try to tell everybody. I mean, these parks and these creeks and these streams and these detention basins that we're restoring, they're not for me. They're for my kids or my grandkids, because they'll still be there and hopefully they'll still be enjoyed by these generations, especially in these urban areas where there's very limited amount of these areas left.
And we need to protect them.
And we need to protect them.
Well, thank you for coming down to the podcast today.
Sure. Thank you very much, Mark.
Matt, that was a great conversation with Coilin McConnell. I learned a ton about natural resources. For our entire team here at Baxter Women, check what's on the menu next.